In one way, the Vietnam War was unique. It was the first televised war, the first war shown night after night in your living room. So many pictures, so many sounds. What did they all add up to? This will not be a definitive history of the Vietnam War. Inevitably, we have left out much more than we included. What remains is a portrait of what Vietnam was like. That portrait includes some stories we had forgotten over the years and other stories that we could never forget. Much of this report will deal with the years of American military involvement. But to set the stage for that, we begin with a brief look at how we got there. Charles Collingwood narrates.
There has been fighting in Vietnam for 30 years. At the end of World War II, Vietnamese nationalists, calling themselves the Viet Minh, rose to shake off French colonialist rule. They were under the Marxist leadership of Ho Chi Minh and a little band of lieutenants, including the North Vietnamese military genius Vo Nguyen Giap. In the long struggle that ensued, the United States supported the French first with money, then with arms. The first American military hardware sent to the French consisted of 8 old transport planes. That was in 1950, in the Truman administration. It was under President Eisenhower that we really got in deep. We were paying 80% of the cost of the French effort. The French were paying in blood. 200,000 casualties in 8 years. They were losing more officers a year than they were graduating from their military academy at Saint-Cyr. Public opinion in France turned against the war, as it was later to do in the United States. The end for the French came in 1954 at a place called Dien Bien Phu, an appalling military position the French mistakenly decided to defend at all cost. After a 55-day siege by superior Viet Minh forces, with their perimeter shrunk to the size of a baseball field, the French surrendered. The loss of Dien Bien Phu affected French opinion as the 1968 Tet Offensive was to affect American. They decided they could not win the war, and they got out. There followed the Geneva Conference of 1954, in which the Russians and Chinese, as well as the Americans, British, and French, were represented. They reached an agreement dividing the country along the 17th parallel, but looking forward to its eventual reunification. It was no better observed by either side than the later Paris Agreement of 1973. The United States, under President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, at once moved to pick up the sword the French had dropped. We backed South Vietnam with money, military supplies, and advisors to train them in their use. The object was to preserve the government in Saigon of the South Vietnamese leader we supported, President Ngo Dinh Diem. In the early 1960s, the war began to go badly for Diem. He became increasingly aloof from his people, and perhaps more important, he lost the confidence of the Americans. In November 1963, American officials turned a blind eye to a coup against Diem, in which he and his brother Nhu were murdered. The fall of Ngo Dinh Diem, far from weakening the American commitment to his successors, only served to strengthen it.
In November of 1963, President Kennedy was murdered. Lyndon Johnson became the President of the United States. And then it was 1964. 16,000 American military advisors were in Vietnam then. And in the summer of '64, a relatively minor incident with major consequences was about to occur off the North Vietnamese coast. Morley reports.
On August 2nd, 1964, the United States claimed that the U.S. destroyer Maddox had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. In retaliation, President Johnson ordered airstrikes on North Vietnamese naval bases, and he recommended that Congress pass a resolution that would give him authority to take any military action necessary to protect the forces of the United States and prevent further communist aggression. The Tonkin Resolution was adopted unanimously by the House and by a vote of 88 to 2 in the Senate. What President Johnson did not tell us is that the Maddox was on a spy mission in North Vietnamese waters, so the whole thing was fishy from the start. But the president would later use the Tonkin Resolution to justify all American action in Vietnam. But back in '64, it was still a dirty little war fought by the Vietnamese and a few American advisors, and Peter Kalischer was reporting it.
This was a borderline village controlled by the Viet Cong at night, accessible to government troops by day. From the village or near here, ground fire wounded an American observation plane pilot and brought a bombing and strafing attack in retaliation. 5 houses burned to the ground. We walk into the village with government troops while they're still ablaze. No one is seriously hurt. The little girl has a scratched face. A Vietnamese medic treats her. The Viet Cong, as usual, are not around. Only the weeping women and one man with a blank, distant stare. The government occupied the village and lost it. They can sometimes recruit more Viet Cong than they kill. Most of the fighting in Vietnam does not involve planes or helicopters or even battalions. Just small groups of men stalking and ambushing each other in jungle, swamp, and rice paddy. In an average month, there are 350 separate firefights involving less than 100 men. And they, not the big operations, are what cost the government the majority of its 1,700 monthly casualties, and the Viet Cong almost as many.
In November of 1964, communist terrorists staged a devastating attack on an American installation at Bien Hoa Air Base. That same year, on Christmas Eve, they bombed the American officers' billet in downtown Saigon. And then in February 1965, at Pleiku in the Central Highlands, they bombarded the American compound with mortars and attacked on the ground with troops. President Johnson retaliated. He ordered round-the-clock bombing of North Vietnam. He also ordered massive air support for South Vietnamese forces. In July 1965, a visiting correspondent went along on a bombing mission.
This is Lieutenant Colonel Dan Farr of Los Angeles, commander of the 8th Fighter Bomb Squadron here at Da Nang Air Base, a squadron equipped with B-57s. The British call them Canberra jets. We're using them very effectively here in this war in Vietnam to dive bomb the Viet Cong in these jungles beyond Da Nang here. Colonel, what's our mission we're about to embark on?
Well, our mission today, sir, is to report down to the site of the ambush 70 miles south of here and attempt to kill the VC that perpetrated the ambush and that are still in the area back in the hills.
The area we're going to bomb is only about 70 miles from Da Nang Air Base, but it's a long 70 miles out there to where the war is being fought. That's forward air controller. He's up there on a small plane, flying low and spotting the Viet Cong. I see a white plume of smoke. The colonel has just advised me that that is our target area right over there. And now we're making our pass, and we're beginning to go down. We're heading down toward that area. 1, 2, 3, 4, we dropped our bombs, and now a tremendous G-load as we pull out of that dive. Oh, I know something of what those astronauts must go through. Wow. We dropped our bombs, it looks to me as if just to the right, which would be a little bit to the east of the earlier B-57 bombs, and it would appear to me we must have been just about on that smoke plume.
At the end of '65, almost 1,500 Americans had been killed in Vietnam. Defense Secretary McNamara said that the military situation had deteriorated and more American troops were needed, and more were sent. Charles Kuralt spent some time with one American platoon.
They think they got him, but they know the enemy called Charlie is really a squad of snipers or a platoon firing in rotation. These are the two specialists working on the problem. Duenas, who knows where the sniper is, and Floyd, who knows how to hit him with the big guns.
Yeah, well, see, this is what I'm getting at. Right now, we're too far to the right as we're looking at him, and if we know where he got to go across there, and every day he seems to go right back out through the thickest part of the jungle.
No, he seems to go this way. If he fires from here, you can expect him to go there. If you spotted a movement here, you can expect him here again. This happens every time. We never fail yet.
Just leave it where it is and make a shift from it. You'd be better off. Because if you start bringing it on...
See what the ground looks like. Get up. I know where you gotta go. See, before we're just shooting out there. We'll find out what it looks like this afternoon.
I'll tell you where we'll spot him from here in 3 places, the movement. And then we can expect to be shot at from that area there twice now. He got one of our boys right here.
Hey, Sergeant Bartlett.
Floyd, the artillery sergeant, decides he has to go out in the afternoon through the minefield to see the ground for himself. Duenas will lead him.
When we think we got a hit, we'll go out this afternoon and check for blood, over.
There were so many explosions along that perimeter, that mined and booby-trapped and enemy-infested line of jungle, that we could not be sure which explosion it was. All we knew was that McFall and Sergeant Floyd, the artillery observer, and Sergeant Duenas, the quiet expert on mines, were out there with a squad covering them. And then suddenly there was a call for medics to the 3rd Platoon perimeter. Sergeant Floyd, who had to see the ground for himself. He was the one, apparently, who tripped the mine. Part of Ralph Beausoleil's platoon, ignoring the danger, had raced into the jungle to pull the 3 men out. Another had driven a truck across the sniper's line of fire to serve as an ambulance for Floyd, and now drove it as fast as it would go, a wild half-mile through the rubber trees, down the perimeter, to the battalion aid station. Sergeant Floyd, who had to see the ground for himself.
4-inch ace wrap.
Damn.
Don't lose that water. Okay. That morphine will start working in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Now, see if you get the leg lifted up a bit.
Yes, man, I'll pick it up.
Give him a tetanus shot.
All I gotta say, that little Charlie fella running around out there bothering us all. I hope they get him. I hope they get him.
Give me another 8-inch.
I'm sure they will.
I guess he earned a Purple Heart.
What were you doing out there?
We were just physically reconning the area to see, you know, this morning where the sniper was this morning.
Hey, Joe, another 4-inch wrap.
We were looking for, maybe possibly they hit him this morning, you know. We were looking around there, and evidently he booby-trapped our booby-traps because the sergeant with me knew. He knew where ours were set up.
Take it easy.
And
You need some more water?
it's just one of those things.
How about some more water?
But that's the way it goes, I guess. Win some, lose some.
Somebody getting a tetanus.
Hey, Jack, find something we can put across here to rest his head on.
Yes, sir.
Uncomfortable, but...
Now, okay.
Just turn it off. I'll put her on.
You feeling better now with each other morphine?
Not yet, man. That leg's about to get me.
Oh, you will. I'll be better.
Now, try to keep that arm quiet, right? As soon as that bottle's drained, they'll take it out for you, okay?
Gotcha, sir.
That morphine will take hold in about 15 minutes.
Damn.
Of the 3 men who went into the bush that day, 1 survived unhurt. Sergeant Duenas died, and Sergeant Floyd lost that leg. By the autumn of 1965, there were 100,000 Americans in Vietnam. One of their missions was to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. The Marine Corps was doing most of the fighting then. We went along on an operation in a hamlet called Cam Ne.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. The old and the very young. The Marines have burned this old couple's cottage because fire was coming from here.
It first appeared that the Marines had been sniped at and that a few houses were made to pay. Shortly after, an officer told me he had orders to go in and level the string of hamlets that surrounds Cam Ne village. And all around the common paddy field that feeds these hamlets, a ring of fire. 150 homes were leveled in retaliation for a burst of gunfire. In Vietnam, like everywhere else in Asia, property, a home, is everything. A man lives with his family on ancestral land. His parents are buried nearby. Their spirit is part of his holding. If there were Viet Cong in the hamlets, they were long gone, alerted by the roar of the amphibious tractors and the heavy barrage of rocket fire laid down before the troops moved in. The women and the old men who remained will never forget that August afternoon. Years ago, U Thant, trying to get negotiations going on Vietnam, said, "As you know, in times of war, truth is the first casualty." From Tonkin Gulf through the Paris peace talks, anyone who spent any time in Vietnam knows the wisdom of that statement. Official statements always seemed to be at odds with what was happening in Vietnam. And from the beginning, there was extraordinary pressure on reporters and their bosses to get on the team to confirm in Vietnam what was stated in Washington. The pressure sometimes took the form of threat. After that Cam Ne report, an open threat to one correspondent to get out of Vietnam or get a bullet in the back. The pressure, as far as I know, was always resisted.
There are many ways to measure the American involvement in Vietnam: men, dollars, sorties, bomb tonnage. But in 1966, for the first time, American involvement was measured in terms of large-scale casualties. 5,000 Americans died in Vietnam that year. The nature of the war was changing, as Bruce Morton reports.
1966 was the year of the big buildup. More than 200,000 American men and more than $2 billion American dollars per month went to the Vietnam War that year. U.S. planes bombed oil storage tanks on the edge of Hanoi, and in the South, Americans tried to fight their kind of war: search and destroy, set battles, firepower, helicopters, and high explosives. But the Viet Cong were hard to find and insisted on fighting their kind of war. Sometimes the war got downright confusing, as Dan Rather discovered one day, not far from Saigon.
What's going on? That's an airstrike. Get hold of it. Located. Where's it landing? Back here? 242, that's 9-4, over. Get up here. Harry, this is Ohio, over. Get out of the road, Ludo. Harry, this is Ohio, over. This is Ohio. Stop that airstrike. It's coming a little too close, Harry. Stop the airstrike.
In the first confusing moments, the company commander thinks we're being hit by our own artillery or airstrikes. But those are enemy shells coming in. Because of the French Army's sad experience with tanks and other armor in Vietnam, U.S. forces have been leery of using it. But this is the dry season, and the terrain here is comparatively high. And some of the brass insist on experimenting with armor. The tanks and armored personnel carriers move less than 2 miles from the camp when one tank is disabled by a mine. Enemy fire opens up from surrounding bushes, and a furious fight to defend the tanks ensues. Is it a full ambush, or just a few snipers taking advantage of the minings? The armored column's commander takes no chances. He orders all the firepower he can muster to rake the jungle.
Cong has opened fire on the convoy. We're now firing back and have asked rare support.
It's this way approximately half the time still in South Vietnam when we try to move convoys. Dan Rather, CBS News, with the 1st of the 16th, 1st Division, Tank Attachment Element, South Vietnam.
In May of '66, South Vietnamese troops in Da Nang rebelled against the government in Saigon. The politics and the war were confusing, as was apparent in this report from Eric Sevareid.
We're in the center of Da Nang. Off about 100 yards ahead is the school and the radio station. The fight at this moment is about the station. One tank right over there at about 1 o'clock is moving now toward the station. 1,000, or rather a battalion of South Vietnamese Marines arrived from Saigon this morning, to everybody's surprise, particularly the American authorities here and probably those in Saigon. There's some more shooting now, machine gun from over behind that row of houses, about 300 yards right off that way. There's more of it.
Sevareid later reported that Marshal Key had sent loyal Marines into Da Nang to seize command. The Army's First Corps had rebelled against Saigon in support of dissident Buddhists in Hue, who opposed the Key regime. Key hadn't told American officials in Vietnam what he was going to do, but it worked. The Marines regained control in Da Nang. The pacification program aimed at driving the Viet Cong out of the villages and organizing pro-government Vietnamese to keep them from coming back. Charles Collingwood was with a group of refugees when they returned to their pacified village.
You must realize what an act of faith this represents. They've been in a refugee camp for over a year. Their village has been under Viet Cong control. The government hasn't really controlled it for many years. Now, the government thinks it does. These people are depending on the promises of the government of Vietnam and the United States Army that we will keep them safe and keep the VC away. We can only imagine the doubts and fears with which these people come back to this hamlet of theirs. And we can only imagine their reaction if once again the government fails to protect them. It could fail through obstruction at the top, or incompetence at the working level, or through any of the 1,001 reasons which cause most crusades to fail. But something is being tried in Vietnam today that is worth trying. We are watching, and it's exciting to watch, an effort to create a national rebirth. It can succeed and should succeed. If it fails, it would be more than the failure of just another program of rural construction. Because we're beginning to run out of time, and if this fails, there may not be time enough or appetite enough to try again. It is still true that neither military victory nor a negotiated peace can solve the problems of Vietnam that so many Americans have come over here to solve unless there is also a national rebirth.
The U.S. came up with another program that cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year, yet kept going wrong somehow. Morley reports on the aid program.
The black market is the smallest and the most overt example of how funds, food, and goods are diverted from the Vietnamese economy directly into the hands of private speculators, and from there into the hands of the Viet Cong. This is one of the most lucrative rackets of all, the traffic in milk. At any Saigon corner, you can buy for $1 a box, give away U.S. aid powdered milk. There is no attempt to conceal the fact. The box is marked with the clasped hands and the stars and stripes, and emblazoned with the motto, "Not to be sold or exchanged."
Safer also reported that corruption went to the highest levels of the Saigon government, and that the Viet Cong had a sophisticated supply system based on corruption on the black market. As we found out, the war made Saigon into a city where the powerful flaunted their riches and the powerless were ignored.
Saigon's major industry is war. There are winners and losers here as on a battlefield. The war rich, the war poor. These are some of the losers. They live mainly on rice. Wholesale price has risen 25% in the last 30 days. Most food prices go up every month. Wounded veterans, a man who's lost both legs or both eyes, gets a pension of his full base salary. For a private, that's about $12 a month, the price of the dinner in a fancy Saigon restaurant. A man with one arm gets half that, the price of lunch. They have little money and little hope. But Saigon has its winners, too. For the winners, it's a new experience. The French used to run things. Saigon's new rich literally have more money nowadays than they know how to spend. So the generals' wives and the ladies who own the nightclubs have a new hobby, the trance. Sometimes dancing, sometimes reaching for a stack of money to shower it on the musicians and on the friends who have come to watch with their puzzled Americans in tow. Piles of food, piles of money, La Dolce Vita, Saigon style. And later in the morning, there are cigarettes daubed with opium to make the party a success.
I remember being out with the Marines one day up north. We'd drawn some fire from a village. The Marine commander called in air support and the firing stopped. As we walked into the village, an old woman with napalm burns, the result of that airstrike, came out to meet us. The medic did what he could for her and said, "Anybody who thinks we're going to win their hearts and minds this way is out of his mind." That was the problem, of course. We couldn't make converts with gunships or free fire zones, so we tried to do it with pacification, with aid, but it always went wrong. Corruption beat pacification every time. Some Vietnamese hated what was happening to their country. CBS News cameraman Hatu Khan, who filmed those trance scenes, was angry at what the rich were doing. And Vietnamese and Americans could and did argue over who corrupted whom. But nobody, not Hatu Khan, not Marshal Key, not anybody in Saigon or Washington could do anything about it. Corruption lived. You could buy anything in Saigon in those days. Anything, that is, except hearts and minds, or victory, or peace.
We continue with the story of 1967, reported by Dan Rather.
During 1967, the United States continued its buildup in Vietnam. By the end of that year, the number of American soldiers in Vietnam would reach the 500,000 mark. In Saigon, a new constitution was adopted and Premier Key agreed to hold popular elections. Thieu was elected president and Key vice president. Here in the United States, opposition to the war grew. More than 50,000 Americans marched on the Pentagon and demonstrated at the Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial. Radicals shouted support for the Viet Cong. In Vietnam, CBS newsman Ike Pappas reported one of the many atrocities of the war.
Deep in the Delta, evidence of how the Viet Cong treats its prisoners. They were massacred, trussed, and left to die in this common grave. They were inmates at a Viet Cong prison camp near Long My, 130 miles southwest of Saigon, most of them Vietnamese Army men. American commanders on the scene said the Viet Cong had killed 41 persons. Some were tied, others chained. At first, the Army said 6 persons survived the massacre, but there was a 7th. He stumbled from his hiding place in a nearby patch of brush after Vietnamese troops swept through the camp. He is about 40 years old, has been a Viet Cong prisoner for a year. He is himself badly hurt. He has a deep gash in his head from a bayonet. The Viet Cong left him for dead. When the VC departed, the man crawled into a nearby clump of bushes, and there he stayed until the helicopters came. How did they try to kill the other prisoners?
Yes, they saw the VC threw hand grenades and shoot bayonet and kill everyone.
The United States brought enormous power to bear in Vietnam, the latest in aircraft, artillery, and individual weapons. Mike Wallace came across an unusual weapon in May of that year.
This Rome plow, made in Cedartown, Georgia, may not look like much of a weapon, but it turns out it's a potent weapon in the fight against the Viet Cong. The engineers of the 1st Division are using it to knock down the jungle and so deny the VC a sanctuary in Binh Duong province north of Saigon, the spot General William Westmoreland once called the toughest province in all Vietnam for VC domination. This is the village of Phu Chan, whose 4,000 residents used to be safe only during the day. At night, the Viet Cong would come out of the dense jungle that surrounded Phu Chan to collect their taxes, get their provisions, terrorize the villagers. But now the jungle around Phu Chan has been knocked down. It's gone. And so is the Viet Cong. They had no place to hide. But the dozers do more than just knock things down. They help to build, too. The man in charge of the operation is Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig of Arlington, Virginia.
This is land that was formerly non-productive and of no value at all to the people.
Because it was jungle.
That's correct.
Lieutenant Colonel Haig later became the fastest moving officer in the Army. Within 5 years, he was a 4-star general, and he later replaced Bob Haldeman as President Nixon's chief of staff. More than anything else, the American military stressed mobility. To find the enemy, you had to move. And as CBS reporter Don Webster found out, there were times when the enemy found you first.
Boy, those bullets are close.
How many men are wounded, did you say?
They just brought in that gun. Maybe a few minutes before they get a chance to use it. And now suddenly it started to rain. These summer monsoon rains that hit in a flash and leave just as fast. They're working on him, trying to save his life. See that shrapnel. They're giving him artificial respiration. As a matter of fact, they couldn't get in here. There's too much heavy fire. Trying to start his heart beating again. These frantic efforts were to no avail. The wounded man was dead. It's amazing in a situation like this how much you can hear and how little you can see. Everybody's flat on their face in the grass. Can't see a thing. No smoke, no flames, no nothing. But it sounds like the whole world's exploding around you.
In Saigon, the government was as unpopular as ever. Student demonstrations were often difficult to report. The police usually broke up the demonstrations, but they didn't like Americans to film them at their task. John Lawrence describes one incident.
The 200 policemen cleared the street of students in 5 minutes, and then they turned on newsmen. CBS News correspondent Bert Quint, cameraman Keith Kay, and soundman Pham Chan were the first targets. They had not yet taken any pictures, and they were arguing their right to cover the activities of the students and the police. But the police didn't want any pictures taken, and they enforced their will with the clubs. There comes a point in a fight when the distinction becomes blurred between the reasonable use of force and brutality. It can be reported that the CBS News men covering the story stood their ground until it became apparent that in the face of overwhelming strength, it was necessary to retreat.
In all, 6 employees of CBS News were clubbed, beaten, and driven back by police.
The CBS crew finally withdrew. Quint and Kay went to the hospital, had their wounds dressed, and returned to duty. While the political battle continued in Saigon, the war continued in the field. Robert Shackney reported on the results.
Very often after a heavy battle, it's hard to tell who won and who lost. But in this case, the evidence of victory is very clear.
There were 48 bodies of dead enemy soldiers piled up in the perimeter of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry, awaiting burial. There are battles when it's difficult to know how badly the enemy has been hurt. But after the fight here last night, the troops of the U.S. 1st Division held their ground and could count the bodies of the men they had killed.
In combat, there are no niceties. A dead enemy soldier is simply an object to be examined for documents, then removed as quickly as possible, sometimes crudely. No one says a prayer here or holds a funeral service. These had been living, breathing men yesterday. Today, they are just a sanitation problem. Robert Shackney, CBS News, near the Cambodian border.
One of the biggest stories of 1968 wasn't known publicly for years. Lieutenant William Calley led his platoon through a South Vietnamese village named My Lai. They killed 128 civilians. And 1968 would raise some serious questions about how the war was going. Robert Shackney tells why.
In December 1967, General Westmoreland said that the pacification program was going so well that the enemy was no longer capable of attacking a single district or province capital in Vietnam. Then in February 1968, the Communists launched the Tet Offensive. They attacked almost every capital city in South Vietnam and occupied the old city of Hue. The attack began with the penetration of the American embassy in Saigon, and this was part of our report that day.
This is where the Viet Cong raiders broke in. They'd sneaked up and blasted a hole in the reinforced concrete fence surrounding the compound. They were inside before anyone knew it. They had the big embassy wall to protect them. But none of the raiders lived to tell of their exploit. By 8 o'clock, 5 hours after they first broke in, almost all of them were dead. The fighting went on for a total of 6 hours before the last known Viet Cong raider was killed. They were rooted out of bushes, from outlying buildings, and then the last one, the 19th, from the small residence of the embassy's mission coordinator, George Jacobson, who'd been hiding out all alone all morning. You had quite an escape at the very end. How did that happen?
Well, they put riot gas into the bottom floors of my house, which, of course, would drive whoever was down below up top where I was. They had thrown me a pistol about 10 minutes before this occurred. And with all the luck that I've had all of my life, I got him before he got me.
With the
I'm
pistol,
sorry.
and he had what?
An M16.
And you got him.
The Viet Cong made their boldest move at Hue in the north, capturing much of that ancient city and holding it for almost 3 weeks. Both sides took heavy casualties, as Don Webster reported.
Roger, that was some sort of rifle grenade. It came all the way through the building, hit over one. Have you pushed forward?
In the front ranks of the Marines, a man is suddenly wounded. He's been hit in the eye by shrapnel from an enemy B-40 rocket. Despite the obvious pain, doctors later told him he will not lose the eye. And although the sound of the blast punctured his eardrum, he will not lose his hearing. But all the time, the Marines have had their eyes on that enemy flag. It's flying on a pole in front of the province capitol building.
We've got Charlie on the run behind him. They're cutting him down now. As soon as the pink one's secure, flag goes up.
Finally, the assault. They're approaching what used to be the most important government building in the province. Now, with no province government at all, it has no significance at all, except for the flag in front.
When you let me know it's good enough to let Gabby Hayes run it up, over.
With fighting still going on just a few yards away, Marines have risked their lives to pull down this symbol.
Wait, one. Where's on the other hook? I'll get him.
No one is quite sure where the American flag came from in the middle of a battle. Like so many things, when you need something, someone just happens to have it. There was no bugler, and the other Marines were too busy to salute. But not often is a flag so proudly raised.
All right, give me this then.
Hungry Hard Hotel Company. Keep it.
Are you finished? We want to get the hell out.
15 seconds. Hey,
Then suddenly a surprise.
let's get some men to check these holes over here.
Come on out of here.
Can we hold on now? Still alive. Hey, get over here and help me drag this man out of here.
Rimming the edge of the courtyard, someone noticed small holes camouflaged. In almost every one, there's an enemy soldier. A few dead from the day's shooting, but some still alive.
The road, the only road open out of here, Highway 1, the main highway of commerce in South Vietnam in normal times, has been closed today. An ambush along the road turned back the first convoy that tried to get up here. The ambush wasn't cleared, and so the second convoy today turned back as well. And today, at any rate, Hue is cut off because the weather is bad and there is no air support nor air supply. Right now, the Navy and the Army boats that also bring supplies up the Perfume River are having to undergo heavy small arms and mortar fire as they turn the bend in the river here around Hue itself. And the landing zone on this, the south side of the river, has been under almost constant mortar and small arms fire.
Northwest of Hue, the Marine base at Khe Sanh had been under siege for weeks. During Tet, thousands of enemy shells landed within its perimeter. Cut off from the rest of Vietnam, it was supplied by air. The siege at Khe Sanh was still underway in March when President Johnson, responding to growing discontent with the war, ordered a halt to the bombings of North Vietnam and announced he would not run for re-election. By the end of 1968, both sides had agreed to sit down at the negotiating table and try to end the war. Though progress would be slow, all four belligerents were represented, and the Paris peace talks finally began. In 1968, we learned more about the enemy in Vietnam. Bernard Kalb prepared a special broadcast on the Viet Cong. The film, obtained from many sources, told a chilling story: deadly homemade booby traps, and a calculated policy of political assassination.
The enemy first made its appearance in the form of isolated, scattered acts of terrorism. The war began a death at a time. The pictures you are about to see are ghastly to look at, but they are part of the horror that has afflicted both sides in this war. The VC do not use their terror indiscriminately. That would destroy their support. They terrorize selectively to isolate the rural population from Saigon and to control the people, whether by allegiance or by intimidation. Their victims include village officials, administrators, school teachers, revolutionary development workers. Since 1958, the VC have been charged with more than 14,000 civilian assassinations and more than 45,000 kidnappings. This is perhaps the most grisly atrocity carried out by the VC. They used flamethrowers against people who had only recently learned to use matches. The Montagnard village of Doc San was turned into ashes. It was the VC way of trying to recruit other Montagnards into helping VC units operating in the mountains.
Later in 1968, CBS News took another look at the enemy, this time in Hanoi with its hundreds of thousands of tiny bomb shelters. Charles Collingwood was the first Western television reporter to visit Hanoi, and back home he reflected on what he had seen.
The Vietnamese have a marked gift for ingenious improvisation. You see it not only in the North Vietnamese medicine and civil defense, but in the way they cope with the interruptions caused to communications by United States bombing. For instance, in Hanoi, the great steel Dumer Bridge across the Red River, which connects Hanoi with almost everywhere else, has been cut by American bombs. This is U.S. Air Force film. For some reason, the North Vietnamese won't let you film the broken bridge. But they did let us show for the first time how they've managed to span the river in spite of the damage to the Dumer Bridge. They've rigged a pontoon bridge. By day, this bridge is dismantled. The pontoons moored and camouflaged beside the riverbank. Then in the late afternoon, when they think the danger of bombing has become less acute, they tow the pontoons up and put them into place. It takes an hour and a half from the time the sections leave the riverbank until the bridge is assembled. They put it together and take it apart like this every day.
There isn't much question that the year 1968 was the turning point of the American part of the war in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive shattered a lot of illusions about pacification and body count, and about computer printouts that were telling us we were winning the war when in fact we were not. A lot of soldiers, including General Westmoreland, will still argue that the communists lost and that we won at Tet, that the communists captured none of their objectives or could not hold on to what they captured, that they suffered severe casualties. But to those of us who were there, Tet suggested something else, that all of those years of search and destroy, of defoliation, of secret bombings of Laos, of pacification had not meant a thing, that the other side could launch a major attack all over Vietnam with total surprise, that nothing American armed forces had done had really changed anything. I remember that after Tet, we could no longer enter many villages that supposedly had been pacified. It turned out that all we ever had in those villages was an army of occupation.
In November of 1968, the United States elected a new president. His name was Richard Nixon. And the next year, he began pulling Americans out of Vietnam. In 1969, the Paris peace talks floundered along with about the only definite progress and agreement on the shape of the table. It was round. In June, President Nixon began withdrawing some of the 540,000 American troops. 3 such reductions were announced in 1969, a pullback totaling 110,000 men. And then came 1970. As the number of American troops in Indochina got smaller, their battleground got larger. John Lawrence reports.
The beginning of the end of American involvement became evident in the spring of 1970, as the gears of the Vietnam death machine were grinding more slowly. 4,000 Americans were to die that year, many more Vietnamese, and for the first time, Cambodians. 10 days after promising to withdraw another 150,000 American troops from Vietnam, President Nixon, on his own authority and without the advice or consent of Congress, decided to widen the war. It was time, he said, to take action, to clean out the communist sanctuaries in Cambodia. He gave his generals the authority to do what they wanted, to send some 31,000 American soldiers across the border in a final and fateful assault into Cambodia. Huge quantities of arms and ammunition, mostly outdated or obsolete, were captured. But the retreating North Vietnamese and Viet Cong carried the war deep into Cambodia and laid the foundation for the successful struggle of the Khmer Rouge. The intervention in Cambodia triggered sharp and strenuous protests in the United States, mainly at hundreds of college campuses, most notably at Kent State University. National Guardsmen senselessly opened fire into a crowd of demonstrators, killing 4 students and wounding 9. In the months before the Cambodian operation, dozens of brief but bitter battles were fought along the border. Richard Threlkeld accompanied one American patrol that came under fire.
DeValle is the lone medic in the platoon. He's scared from the moment he gets out of the chopper to the moment it picks him up. Scared that someday he's going to get killed picking up a wounded buddy. Jorgensen just became a sergeant, but he doesn't like it. He'd rather be up walking point, where the action is. He's already got 3 Purple Hearts, so everybody calls him Hero. Somewhere in this jungle, there's several hundred North Vietnamese soldiers who could wipe out this little American unit to the last man in an unguarded moment.
Okay. Okay, would you roll in?
All right, who's wounded? All right, give me some cover. Get him back here if you can. Can you move him? Okay, try to bring him back here. Remember to stop the bleeding.
And DeValle, the medic, having survived another rescue mission, brings back his wounded man. Who is it? Who is it? The question spreads down the line. Oh, Christ, it's Hero, the sergeant who likes to walk point. How bad is it? A couple of leg wounds.
I looked up and spotted, it was an NVA, he had a green uniform, had an AK, and it was like a, quick draw old thing. I opened up in him, he opened up in me. Yeah, I'm afraid it works that way. But he's lying up there on the trail.
Roger that. We haven't taken fire.
President Nixon called the Cambodian intervention the most successful operation of the war. But a month after it began, Bert Quint found the Cambodian side of the border infested with communist troops who had already captured 8 journalists.
As we moved up to film the farmers inside, we noticed a couple of soldiers, maybe 200 feet away. They were wearing khaki and carrying rifles. There was no doubt in our minds. These were Vietnamese communists, perhaps coming over here to pick up the rice. We figured that if we remained, we would be captured like our colleagues. So we decided we would run. But by now the soldiers were only about 100 feet away, and they opened fire with their rifles on full automatic burst. Fortunately, they were bad shots. Most of the hail of bullets whizzed past our little car. One round, though, as we sat and lay tumbled in the vehicle, spun by my hair and hit our French sound technician, Patrick Forrest. It tore through his arm and into his knee. We kept going, racing bullets and now racing Patrick's loss of blood as well on a 12-mile run for aid in Sevareid. As we approached the city, we passed Cambodian troops lounging about, troops that rarely go on patrol because they know what they would find, and they don't really want to challenge the communists. They feel they're not yet strong enough. Our decision to run for it had cost us 1 wounded man, but we figured we had gotten off cheaply. The alternatives had been capture or death.
By 1970, it was possible to detect a difference in the attitudes of American combat soldiers. They knew that the war was winding down, that the U.S. government was pulling them out of Vietnam, and they didn't want to become the last casualties of a long and deadly war. There was still danger on every jungle patrol. One unit with a special sense for caution was Charlie Company. On April 6th, we witnessed a unique event, a temporary revolt against a commanding officer.
I'm not going to walk down there. What's Tucker doing? What's Tucker going to do? He's going to walk down the trail. My whole squad ain't walking down there. No. That's it.
The leader of 2nd Platoon looks on helplessly as 2nd Squad turns back, away from the road. He listens sympathetically. But since 2nd Squad was on point, leading the company, the entire column is held up. Captain Rice insists on obedience.
We're going to move out on the road, period. Now, either we're going to move out and they're going to get left behind, or I'm going to take the point and they can follow me if they want to. Now, it's that simple. Now, we got a job to do, we're going to do it. It's not half as dangerous as doing some of the crap we've done out here in the boonies, walking through them. At least we can see what we're doing. Now, they either move out, or else I move out, and they sit on their butt right here. It's that simple.
The young lieutenant tries to persuade Rice to change his orders, but the company commander is firm. Rice starts down the road himself, but only 5 or 6 men follow. The captain moves about 15 yards when new orders come down from the battalion commander.
Okay, we're not going to be going down the Romeo. We're going to move back down to the Whiskey on the Romeo and make a 3-shipper in a hurry.
He is told to go in the opposite direction, only 300 yards.
Get it over with, we'll move out, and it'll be okay. That's right. The longer we sit here, the worse it gets.
This time, 2nd Squad moves, reluctantly.
Rivera, what do you think of this operation?
I think it's crazy. It's senseless walking down the road. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
What's the problem?
Oh, we just don't want to work on the road. This is one of the things that I told you about when we were wondering what a new CO was going to be like. And these are the kind of things that you don't want to have him be like.
Dad, Dre, they haven't went to the country and walked down a trail yet. They want me to walk down a road.
First time we'll ever be walking down the road.
Say again. Like a duck in a shooting gallery.
Is there a rebellion today?
You might call it that. Back in the world, they call it rebellion. Here, it's just a downright refusal. We had the whole company. The CO says, okay, we're going to walk the road. And the whole company says, no, negative. We've heard too many companies, too many battalions want to walk the road. And that's why they aren't what they are now. They're getting blown away.
Other forms of revolt were becoming more common in the American Army. At an artillery base northeast of Saigon, Gary Shepard found the soldiers getting high on marijuana. At times...
This is probably all SIDS and we're getting busted, but I don't care.
Shotgun.
Fire-based Ares is not unique. What's happening here is also happening to some extent at virtually every other American installation in Vietnam. Recent surveys estimate that well over 50% of the soldiers in Vietnam use marijuana.
That's my good buddy, Sam.
Gary Shepard, CBS News, in War Zone D.
Well, that's cool.
Oh, that was out of sight.
The GIs always knew best about the way things were going in Vietnam. They were closest to it. The combat troops, or grunts as they came to be called, had more insight into the war collectively than all the generals and politicians. and much of the Saigon press corps. And what the grunts knew as early as 1965 was that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong they were fighting were generally tougher, braver, and more determined than their South Vietnamese allies, so that all the airstrikes and combat assaults in the world would not stop them. The grunts knew. By 1970, there were serious signs of dissension within the ranks of the American Army. Thousands of soldiers were AWOL. Many were hooked on hard drugs, like heroin. Others were openly challenging their officers' orders. In extreme cases, there was fragging, deliberate attacks on unpopular commanders. It was the result of a war that had gone on too long, that was impossible to win, and in many minds should never have been started in the first place.
The year was 1971. We didn't know it at the time, but Henry Kissinger was meeting in Paris with North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho, the beginning of secret peace talks. But in Indochina, the war went on as Vietnamization was put to the test. Morton Dean reports.
From the U.S. point of view, in 1971, the war became sanitized. More and more U.S. combat troops were withdrawn. Those still there did less and less of the fighting. The most dramatic military adventure of the year was the thrust into Laos, a temporary and only marginally successful effort to disrupt traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Politically, in Saigon, constitutional democracy was more a facade than a fact. Nguyen Van Thieu re-elected president, but he was alone on the ballot. Back home, the fate of the POWs had become a major issue. When we left Vietnam for good, would we leave the prisoners behind? Is a film from communist sources. This film showing U.S. pilots imprisoned in Hanoi at Christmas time. Americans were getting out of the war, but some were still in it and were re-enlisting. Jed Duval was in Quang Tri with the men of Charlie Horse Company.
Someone has to do it. And most of the ones that stay feel they can do it better than the guy that's just coming over here. I think they actually believe that, or they feel the same way I do, that I'm actually helping somebody over here, that I'm actually doing something that's worthwhile, and that's why they stay.
In 2 months over the terrain west of Quezon, Charlie Horse lost 14 of its men in action. Men who are close to death are close to each other.
1, 2, 3!
The boisterous play includes dousing the new men with beer. The day after the singing and beer tossing, Charlie Horse lost 5 killed when 3 of its choppers were shot down. That day, too, Charlie Horse was rescuing others who were shot down but lived through it. Rescue is not the main mission, scouting is. But they happened on this one, a machine that had gone down and was burning. Riflemen who ride with Charlie Horse guarded the downed bird. There were no enemy around, but one never knows if that will be the case until he lands. Another similar mission. A small chopper, a scout from a sister unit down, having hit the side of a hill. All 3 aboard dead. A man worries about becoming accustomed, hardened to this. He wonders if he should allow himself to make friends. Wonders if love for a buddy has become a luxury. Charlie Horse pilots are fully aware that the danger is constant and substantial where they fly. At least one enemy soldier is seen by the scout.
There's an AK and a pack laying on a rock here. Okay, we got a gook.
Oh, we got a gook.
Okay, roll in that little creek there. We're taking fire out of there. That's it, right there, right there.
Okay, go straight up. Go straight up.
Okay, I think you got him.
Well, that was quick. First thing out, he got a gook.
Put some 50 in there before we look. Good idea.
That's it. That's it, my friend, right in there. Oh, that's beautiful, beautiful.
We really caught him with your pants down.
Yeah, Roger, pants down.
In 1971, the trial of Lieutenant William Calley focused new attention on these photographs, evidence of the massacre at My Lai. 1 year before the Cali trial, Mike Wallace had talked with one of the participants in the massacre, Paul Meadlow.
Lieutenant Cali told me, said, Meadlow, we got another job to do. And so he walked over to the people and they started pushing them off and started shooting them. And I...
What, pushing them off into the ravine?
Off into the ravine. It was a ditch.
No.
And so we started pushing them off. And we started shooting them. So then all together we just pushed them all off and just started using automatics on them. And then...
Again, men, women, children?
Men, women, and children.
And babies.
And babies. Right, they was begging and saying no, no, and the mothers was huddling their children, but they kept right on firing. Or we kept right on firing.
And in 1971, the area was secure enough for a visit. Morley Safer went to see what remained of the hamlet of My Lai.
There are no memorials in My Lai 4. If they didn't take you to it, you wouldn't know there was ever a hamlet there. But it's not a ghost place. By day, there is more life than death in My Lai 4. Around the hamlet, the women and the old men tend the rice paddies. But they do not stay there anymore. At night, My Lai 4 is given back to the dead. No one seems to know exactly where it all happened that March day in 1968. The local militiamen who provide security and guide you in past the booby traps say it was here, there, and everywhere. A massacre is not an organized thing. It's as confusing as any big military operation. You only happen on the graves of My Lai 4, cross a patch of fallow ground, wander towards the remains of someone's house, and you find them, random graves. Some people of My Lai 4 buried in the good earth of Vietnam. But aside from the graves and the rusted tins of sea rations left behind by Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry of the 11th Brigade of the Americal Division, there is no My Lai 4. That part of Quang Ngai Province that we vulgarized as Pinkville simply does not exist.
The intensity of the U.S. air war can best be measured by tonnage. More than 7 million tons of bombs dropped on Indochina, more than was dropped everywhere in World War II. No weapon was more feared in Indochina than the giant high-flying B-52s. Phil Jones filed this report from Utapao, the B-52 base in Thailand.
It is almost a cliche now that the air war is an impersonal war. The men who drop the bombs rarely see their targets or the results of their bombings. This is especially true of the men who fly in the B-52s. We talked with some of these crewmen as they relaxed off base just a few hours after a mission. They are professionals with no qualms about their job. They are convinced it is right and necessary.
I feel that that the bombing doesn't kill any more than's necessary to accomplish a mission. Without the air war and without the bombs being dropped, the communists would probably eat us alive down there. And it's either them or us, the way I feel about it. If the war wasn't being fought here, it'd be fought somewhere else.
You really think the bombs then are keeping the communists away? It is that important?
Well, I can't say it's keeping them away. It's keeping them beat back to where they should be.
Do you think it's effective?
Of course it's effective, or they wouldn't be doing it.
The demand for specialized medical services in South Vietnam overwhelmed the availability. Those who did get help were lucky, as we found out in Quang Ngai. John and Tra have been friends for a long time. They are both 11 years old and were living in the village of Bin Duc, doing the things that young country girls do in Vietnam, playing together, working together, children of poor parents. Now they suffer and hope together. The report at the Quaker Rehabilitation Center reads, on February 19th, 1971, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the two girls and two other friends left their village to go to market to sell wood. While they were walking along the road, a South Vietnamese soldier heard their voices, thought they were the enemy, and detonated a mine. Reports that the war has wound down may seem fanciful to those who crowd the hospital wards. In the first 3 months of this year, the latest period for which statistics were made available to CBS News, more than 10,000 civilians were wounded and hospitalized. Mrs. Errol Kubica, wife of the center's director, is a physical therapist with 4 years' experience in Vietnam. What will happen, do you think, to Tra and Chan, two little girls we've seen here?
Chan will probably be fine because she has just one leg below the knee, lost one leg below the knee. So I think she'll just lead a fairly normal life, be able to go to market and do all the things that that she would expect to do. The sad thing may be that her marriage prospects may be affected by being a disabled person. And that, of course, will be sad for her when she's older. The other little one will have a much harder time. Walking for her will always be difficult. She should walk almost normally, but she won't be able to walk very far. And so she'll manage all right, but she won't do as well as Chan.
To see the agony and heartbreak of those two young girls, Chan and Tra, was to see the war in human terms, stripped of its philosophical, political, and geographical meaning. In terms of the human tragedy, the peace cannot retrieve what the war has claimed. There was no shortage of innocent victims in that war. It is estimated that more than 178,000 South Vietnamese, mostly civilians, had been disabled, including 80,000 persons who are amputees, 30,000 who are blind, 10,000 who are deaf. For them, for those thousands, including Chan and Tra, the end of the war will not mean the end of the suffering.
The year was 1972. This was the year of Watergate, the year of Richard Nixon's landslide re-election. And again, it was a year of death in Vietnam. Charles Collingwood reports.
In early 1972, the Paris peace talks were still stalemated, but not the battlefield. With the advent of spring in 1972 and the dry campaigning season, the North Vietnamese launched their annual end-of-March offensive across the demilitarized zone against the northernmost South Vietnamese provinces. With American troops drawn down now to below 100,000, the North Vietnamese were testing the ability of the South Vietnamese forces to fight on their own. It was close-quarter combat and very fierce, as Bob Simon reported from Route 1 south of Quang Tri.
The ranking South Vietnamese officer quickly decides the communists have been flushed out. He urges his men forward to finish them off. The decision is premature. The officer is the first to fall, an AK round in the chest. Then what everyone had been waiting for, a North Vietnamese soldier in the open, on the run. The men open up with everything they have. From the amount of fire coming at them, government troops had thought they were facing at least a company of North Vietnamese regulars. It turns out to be just a couple of platoons on another suicide mission. One by one, the men blow up the bunkers with hand grenades. They examine the bodies and sift through the belongings. There's a wounded soldier in one of the bunkers, but the men are in no mood to take prisoners.
Up the road, civilians sense that the fighting is over, that the road is open. They come racing down on motorcycles and trucks. Another premature decision. AK fire rings out from a distant bunker. And the communists still have another surprise. The road is mined. It's mined to prevent tanks from coming down, but mines are not very discriminate. A truckload of refugees goes up in smoke. Women, children, babies. Some are dead, some are not dead. By evening, government spokesmen are saying another grand victory has been won in Quang Tri province. The situation is once again stabilized. But there will be more fighting and more words. Words spoken by generals, journalists, politicians. But here on Route 1, it's difficult to imagine what those words can be. There's nothing left to say about this war. There's just nothing left to say. Bob Simon, CBS News, Route 1.
In January of 1973, 4 years of truce talks ended with the signing of the Paris peace agreements. That agreement had not come easily. It followed a year of renewed bombing of the north and the mining of Haiphong Harbor. President Thieu had resisted the agreement. He felt it gained him little. But the United States at least was getting its prisoners back. As the last American POWs were released, Walter Cronkite was in Hanoi.
On the last day of captivity, the prisoners were inspected by this ceasefire's International Control Commission, a formation outside their cells, the half-dressed men grim, unsmiling. Then, seemingly to a silent signal, they marched to their cells. One grasped my hand in passing, only to have a guard break our grip. The paleness of the prisoners seemed to contradict the camp authorities' claim they exercised and played games morning and afternoon. He said, too, that the Americans fought among themselves, but mostly during basketball games. This inspection and the flock of American newsmen may have surprised the prisoners. They seemed somewhat dazed by it all. But the guards said they were told last week they'd be going home in a few days, if nothing happened. We weren't supposed to talk with them, but we managed to sneak in a few words before guards broke it up. These with Master Sergeant James Goff of Fresno, California.
When were you shot?
December 27th. December 27th.
December 27th. B-52. When was the first you knew about a ceasefire?
5 days after it was announced, or after it was signed, yes.
So you had reasonable...
Pardon?
You had reasonable feeling you're going to get out pretty soon, huh?
Outside the camp, a large crowd in holiday, not unfriendly spirits, gathered to await the prisoners' departure in their camouflage buses. Their route took them past some of their own work, the bomb-damaged Long Bien Bridge, and past the destroyed railroad repair yards, and then on to the airport. As the buses stopped outside the airport, the quick, illegal conversations renewed, like questions as to who won the Super Bowl and how other teams were doing.
How are the Boston Bruins doing?
Boston Bruins, how are they doing? Boston Bruins, that's not my team. I don't know.
No.
Just great to see Americans.
Great to see you.
And then the North Vietnamese guards used their last minutes of authority to shut off the conversation again. Those are the last known American prisoners of war. That part of the Vietnam tragedy is over. But they leave behind 1,300 others missing in action. There's not much hope that many of them survive. But now the grim search begins to try to account for everyone, if possible. But for these men, it is now the flight to freedom and on to Clark Field, the Philippines. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, Hanoi, North Vietnam.
The return of the war prisoners was about all that America's long and costly effort in Vietnam had come down to. I made some 17 trips to Vietnam between 1960 and 1972, and I gradually became convinced that we were going about our business there in the wrong way, and that our preoccupation with military victory was unlikely to create the conditions for a viable, independent, democratic South Vietnam, which was our stated goal. In the mid-60s, while we were winning battles, the fabric of South Vietnamese society was already visibly coming apart at the seams. Some perceptive American and South Vietnamese officials were trying to do something about it. Early in 1966, I did a long television examination of all this. It was called The Other War. General Westmoreland, a commander whom I admired as a professional soldier, took me to task for this. Charles, he said, you ought to know very well, there are not two wars here, there is only one, the military war. These people aren't going to build a better society until they're militarily secure. General Westmoreland's adversary, North Vietnam's General Vo Nguyen Giap, took a precisely opposite view. He saw the social structure as the basis for the military effort, not the other way around. For his side, what I called the other war was always of equal importance. In the end, General Giap had the right of it. It was South Vietnam's unattended social and political structure which broke before their armed forces did.
1975 brought the final chapter of the Vietnam War. There'd never really been a ceasefire. Almost from the very beginning, both sides were accusing the other of truce violations. And then it all came apart.
The collapse of South Vietnam was sudden, almost incredibly so. The North Vietnamese began their offensive on March the 4th. Within 2 weeks, President Thieu had decided to abandon much of his country, the northernmost provinces and the Central Highlands. The withdrawal quickly became a rout, civilians and soldiers fleeing in panic, seeking whatever safety they could find, leaving behind huge supplies of American-made war materials. Many of the refugees sought safety in Da Nang, only to discover they were trapped there. They crowded the Da Nang airport, trying to claw their way onto the last flights out. Bruce Dunning filed this report.
As soon as the rear stairway was lowered, the stampede of terrorized people tried to storm the plane. From the cockpit, the pilots reported by radio that the situation was out of control. Several times the pilots moved the plane, hoping to break the crowds around the rear ladder. There was no control. High-ranking officers in Da Nang have fled, leaving soldiers and airmen to fend for themselves. As men clamored over one another, pushing aside women and children in their panic-stricken fury, members of the air crew dragged them onto the plane, trying to fill it as fast as possible. The tension and panic intensified. The heavily armed men were menacing. They left their wives, their children, their aged parents on the runway while they forced their own way on board, a rabble of young enlisted men. CBS News cameraman Mike Marriott and soundman Mai Van Duc dared not leave the plane, aware they might not be able to get back on. Stewardesses dragged people on and rushed them to seats, screaming all the while, "Where are the women and children?" They piled 4, 5, and 6 men into seats intended for 3. Finally, there was room for no more. The plane began to move as people still clambered up the ladder. Angry men left behind fired pistols and automatic weapons at the plane, determined that no one would go if they couldn't. A grenade went off under one wing, damaging it. Unable to move on the blockaded runway, the plane raced down the taxiway, swerving to avoid abandoned vehicles, perhaps even running over people. As the plane strained laboriously into the air, people were still clinging to the wheels and the rear stairs. 7 men fell off as the plane reached heights of 1,000 feet or more. As the plane reached 6,000 feet, 1 man was still stuck in the ladder. As calm fell on the smug men who had managed to fight off their friends and relatives to get on, the hard-working cabin crew took account. 268 people were on board, among them 5 women and 2 or 3 small children. The rest were some of the men whom President Thieu said would defend Da Nang. Once in flight, the pilots assessed the damage to the plane. Bullets had damaged gas lines and the plane was losing fuel. The pilots were not sure the wheels would function on landing because people had attempted to hide in the wheel wells. The flight from Da Nang to Saigon normally takes about 50 minutes. This one took more than an hour and a half. Another World Airways plane flew alongside trying to assess the damage and reported that the cargo hatches were open and full of people.
Do you think the nose gear will come down, or you can't tell yet? Can't tell, and I don't want to check until we get in closer. That's the biggest problem I see at the moment here. Long 945, clear to Saigon. There's something hanging down in the gear, in my gear doors. It may be a body. you say, a body? Well, I can't tell. It sure looks like it.
Not knowing whether the wheel assemblies would hold, the flight crew put the plane, almost empty of fuel, down very gingerly on the runway at Saigon, and the deserters on board cheered. As the plane taxied to a parking place, soldiers poured out of the luggage holds. As cameraman Marriott was filming the unloading, a South Vietnamese Air Force security officer arrested him for taking these pictures. The Air Force had things under control again. But the men and women of World Airways had brought their plane and its load home. Bruce Denning, CBS News, back from Da Nang.
In the waning days of the Vietnam War, an airlift of orphans began. Perhaps they, at least, could escape in time to a new life. But the most heartbreaking tragedy of the war was yet to come. A plane load of orphans crashed. Murray Fromson reported that story.
2 hours ago, I watched this airplane take off from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. It was a perfect takeoff, carrying those orphans to the United States. What can one say except, when will the misery in this country ever stop? The huge plane crashed into a field about 5 miles from the end of the runway, near a small village in Gia Dinh province. There were pieces of wreckage scattered across a half a mile of rice paddy. A fire was slowly burning itself out near the engines. Smashed bodies or parts of them were uncovered by Vietnamese Air Force crews and American officials who rushed to the scene. It was like a combat operation. Helicopters hovered overhead. Body bags were used to remove corpses for identification purposes. Other helicopters came back to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, where the ill-fated trip had begun. American and Vietnamese volunteers removed some of the body bags and other bodies wrapped in white sheets. Scores of ambulances rushed survivors to a nearby hospital. Some of the chaperones were in a state of shock. Moments before, they had been happy to be leaving Saigon. The orphans were to be the first of 2,000 to be airlifted out of Vietnam. Many were mixed blood, the children of Vietnamese women and black American GIs. They would never have had a chance for happiness in Vietnam, where racial prejudice is as strong as in any other country. Now, they have no chance at all.
The war was about to end in neighboring Cambodia. The capital city, Phnom Penh, was surrounded, helpless, on the verge of surrender. Ed Bradley reported those last days in Cambodia.
Death came when they least expected it. The Khmer Rouge gunner changed the coordinates on his captured American-made 105 artillery piece. 1 shell, 2 dead. Their bodies ripped apart by the blast. Morm Varek was luckier. He narrowly escaped death, but never before had the war and the killing left him so dazed. He was walking through the field with his sergeant. They were born within a year of each other and grew up in the same village. The sergeant was looking for a place to relieve himself when he stepped on a mine. Varek, who was walking next to him, caught shrapnel under both eyes. He picked up the body of his friend and placed it in a bunker. His leg had been blown away and there seemed to be no life left in his body. All of this takes place just 10 miles from Phnom Penh. Yet there were no helicopters to evacuate his friend, no blood to give him a transfusion, no morphine to deaden the excruciating pain, no medicine to prevent shock, not even a roll of gauze to bind the stump that is left of his leg. 4 hours after he stepped on that mine, Chun Ben is back in the ambulance, now racing towards Phnom Penh and the 401 hospital. Morm Varek couldn't come to the hospital with his friend. His wounds were considered light, so they were cleaned in the field and he was sent back to his unit. So he wasn't here when his best friend finally received medication and a blood transfusion. And he wasn't here to see his friend's body fight against the pain. And he wasn't here to see Chun Ben die.
In Saigon, it was clear by now the war was lost. The enemy had the men and weapons to overrun the city if he wished. For thousands, this might be the last chance to leave. And they tried to leave, desperately, as Bill Plant reported.
By 8 this morning, there were 1,500 lined up outside the embassy.
They, too, are a part of the U.S. legacy in Vietnam. The American role as protector is about to end, and some of those who once felt safe are now filled with fear. Their faces tell more than words: hope, despair, resignation. They clutched documents, telegrams or letters from relatives in the States, financial guarantees. At midday, there is still a small crowd at the gate to the U.S. consulate. Some are waiting for a letter or telegram of sponsorship from the States. Others grasp for any way out. They gather around any American who ventures near. 3 years ago, a woman says, I worked for a U.S. company in Vietnam. Can I get out? Can you sponsor me, asks another. It is painful to have to tell them that there is nothing you can do.
Those pictures of panic in Da Nang and the lines of Vietnamese outside our Saigon embassy waiting for a piece of paper, their passport to exile in America, they are depressing pictures, but not surprising. There were few among the Vietnamese we worked with there who genuinely believed that it was going to end differently. Jack Kennedy had told us all back in 1963 that we would help, but that it was their war to win. But you don't win a war unless you believe in what you're doing. And it seemed there were more cynics than patriots among the Vietnamese I came to know. They were our clients, did what we wanted, told us what we wanted to hear. They were paid to do that. There was one statistic I remember from 1967 that hit me like a hammer blow. 1 out of every 5 Vietnamese soldiers was a deserter, just up and left for home or for the back alley labyrinths of Saigon. Not because he was a coward, but because the conditions of his army life were so appalling, his officers so uncaring or corrupt that he could find nothing, no leader, no idea to make him a patriot. He was serving time in the army, not a cause.
Domestically, Vietnam was so divisive that in the late 1960s, 2 successive presidents, Johnson and Nixon, dared not go onto a college campus. Thus, it was symbolically appropriate that President Ford chose a campus for his announcement of the end of the long, weary war. Here's how he said it.
Today, America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned.